Hello, my wonderful viewers. Welcome to Unheard Stories, the channel that dives deep into jaw-dropping tales of love, betrayal, and revenge. If you're someone who loves uncovering the messy truths behind cheating stories, you're in the right place. Let's kick things off. Tell me where you're watching from today. Drop it in the comments below. I love hearing from you, and your stories inspire us to keep sharing these unbelievable tales. Before we dive into today's story, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you don't want to miss out on the shocking real-life dramas we have lined up for you. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to give it a like. Your support helps us keep the stories coming. Now let's get into it. Imagine this: a devoted husband, a wife hiding secrets, and a lover who isn't as perfect as he seems. Betrayal, lies, and a plot for revenge. It all collides in a suspense-filled showdown you won't believe. So buckle up and get ready. Today's story will keep you on the edge of your seat from start to finish. Let's dive right in. Meet Sarah. On the surface, she seems like the picture-perfect wife, thoughtful, organized, and devoted to her family. But behind closed doors, her life tells a different story. Every day feels like a loop. Waking up, making breakfast, seeing Mark off to work, and spending her afternoons caught in the mundane rhythm of life. Deep down, Sarah craves excitement, connection, and passion, things she hasn't felt in years. Then there's Mark, her husband. A diligent man with an unshakable work ethic, Mark has spent the last decade climbing the corporate ladder. He works long hours and provides Sarah with a comfortable life, but somewhere along the way the spark in their marriage began to fade. Their conversations are brief, their laughter scarce, and the once vivid love they shared feels like a distant memory. The strain on their relationship is evident. While Sarah tries to fill her emptiness with hobbies and social events, Mark dives deeper into his work. Late nights at the office and distracted evenings at home have become his norm. To Sarah, it feels like Mark has become a ghost in their marriage, present physically but emotionally distant. Enter Ethan, the man who changes everything. Ethan is everything Mark is not: charming, attentive, and seemingly full of life. Sarah meets him at a local cafe during one of her solo afternoon outings. What starts as casual small talk soon turns into long, engaging conversations. Ethan is quick to notice Sarah's restless energy and is even quicker to offer her the attention she's been yearning for. He makes her feel seen, something she hasn't felt in years. At first, Sarah brushes off her growing attachment to Ethan. She tells herself it's harmless, that she's just enjoying the companionship. But the cracks in her marriage to Mark make her vulnerable. Ethan's charisma and understanding create a magnetic pull, and Sarah finds herself wanting more than just casual encounters at the cafe. Back at home, Mark begins to notice subtle changes in Sarah's behavior. She's more guarded with her phone, and her usual routine feels less predictable. Although he can't quite put his finger on it, a nagging feeling tells him that something is off. Their already fragile marriage becomes even more strained as Sarah struggles to balance her feelings for Ethan with her obligations to Mark. Unbeknownst to Sarah, her actions set off a chain of events that will soon unravel her carefully guarded secrets. The cracks in her marriage, once small and unnoticed, are about to widen into chasms. This is where the story truly begins. Stay tuned because things are about to get messy. It started innocently enough. Sarah had been feeling restless, stuck in the monotony of her routine, and decided to spend her afternoon at a quaint cafe downtown. As she sipped her coffee and scrolled through her phone, she noticed a man at the next table watching her with a friendly smile. He was hard to ignore. Ethan, with his confident demeanor and easy charm, exuded a magnetic energy that drew her in. Their first conversation was light and casual. Ethan complimented her on her choice of coffee and shared a funny story about his own caffeine addiction. Sarah found herself laughing, a real, unguarded laugh that she hadn't felt in months. There was something about him that made her feel at ease, almost like she'd known him for years. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah found herself visiting the cafe more often. At first, it was a coincidence running into Ethan, but soon it became intentional. They began to share more about their lives. Sarah spoke of her frustrations, how she felt invisible in her marriage and trapped in a cycle of predictability. Ethan, in turn, revealed his own struggles, painting himself as someone who understood her longing for something more. Ethan wasn't just charming, he was perceptive. He noticed the small details about Sarah, how she twisted her ring when she was nervous or how her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams of traveling. He made her feel seen, heard, and appreciated, which was a stark contrast to the growing distance she felt with Mark. At first, Sarah justified their interactions as harmless. It's just coffee, she told herself. But deep down she knew there was more to it. Ethan's presence filled a void in her life, and she began to crave their conversations. Each time they met, she felt a rush of excitement that had been absent from her life for years. Then came the first touch. It was subtle, a brush of his hand as he reached for her coffee cup, but it sent a jolt through her. Ethan's gaze lingered and Sarah's breath caught. That moment marked the beginning of a shift, where their connection turned from platonic to something more. Their meetings grew more frequent and intimate. What started as conversations at the cafe evolved into long walks in the park, stolen moments in his car, and eventually, secret rendezvous at a cozy motel on the edge of town. Ethan made Sarah feel alive in ways she hadn't experienced in years, and despite her guilt, she couldn't bring herself to stop. But guilt was a constant shadow. Sarah found herself avoiding Mark more than usual. She'd dodge his questions, claim she was meeting friends, or come home late with flimsy excuses. She hated lying to him, but the thrill of her time with Ethan outweighed the shame she felt. Mark, however, wasn't oblivious. He began noticing small but telling changes in Sarah. She was more guarded with her phone, always flipping it face down when she wasn't using it. She started dressing differently, more stylish, as if she was trying to impress someone. And then there were the unexplained absences, the vague excuses that didn't quite add up. One evening, as Sarah returned home later than usual, Mark decided to confront her. "You've been out a lot lately," he said, his tone casual but probing. "Everything okay?" Sarah froze for a moment before forcing a smile. "Oh, just meeting some friends from my book club," she replied, hoping her voice didn't betray her nerves. Mark nodded, but the suspicion in his eyes lingered. He didn't press further, but Sarah could feel his gaze following her as she moved through the house. It was clear that he was beginning to piece things together, even if he didn't have concrete proof yet. As Sarah lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind was a storm of emotions. She knew what she was doing was wrong. Mark didn't deserve this. He was a good man who had always provided for her. But she couldn't deny the way Ethan made her feel, as if she were finally living instead of just existing. The weight of her double life was becoming harder to bear, but Sarah convinced herself she could manage it. She told herself that she deserved happiness, even if it came at a cost. What she didn't realize was that her actions were setting the stage for a revelation that would shatter her world and everyone in it. Little did Sarah know, Mark's suspicions were growing stronger by the day, and the web of lies she had spun was about to unravel in ways she could never have imagined. The stage was set, the players in position, and the fallout was only a matter of time. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Sarah had become a stranger in their own home, distracted, distant, and far too protective of her phone. The once warm and familiar rhythm of their life together now felt fractured, like a melody gone out of tune. Mark wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but the signs were becoming harder to ignore. It started with subtle observations. Sarah's newfound energy when she left the house contrasted starkly with her usual indifference toward social outings. The way she smiled at her phone, quickly tucking it away when he entered the room, sent alarm bells ringing in Mark's mind. At first, he told himself he was imagining things, but doubt began to gnaw at him. One evening, Mark decided to test his instincts. Sarah had mentioned meeting friends for dinner, so he called her just to check in. When she answered, her voice was cheerful but rushed. "Hi. I'm with the girls, it's noisy here but I'll call you back later, okay?" she said before quickly hanging up. Something about her tone felt off. Mark couldn't shake the image of Sarah's face when she lied. A slight hesitation, her voice just a little too bright. That night, Mark began paying closer attention. He checked their shared credit card statements and noticed a charge for a small motel on the outskirts of town. Sarah had never mentioned staying at a motel, and the thought of why she'd need one made his stomach churn. His suspicion solidified into determination. He needed answers. Meanwhile, Sarah was caught up in her whirlwind romance with Ethan, completely unaware of Mark's growing vigilance. Ethan, ever the charmer, had a way of making Sarah feel like the center of the universe. But beneath his smooth exterior was a man who knew exactly how to manipulate her emotions. He listened intently to her frustrations, feeding her discontent with Mark while positioning himself as her escape. "You deserve so much more than this," Ethan would say, his voice dripping with sympathy. "Mark doesn't see you the way I do. He takes you for granted." Sarah found solace in Ethan's words, allowing herself to believe that he truly understood her. But Ethan wasn't as sincere as he seemed. He thrived on the thrill of the affair, enjoying the secrecy and the power he held over Sarah. While he played the role of the perfect confidant, he was careful never to reveal too much about his own life, keeping Sarah in the dark about his true intentions. One evening, Mark decided to follow Sarah. She had claimed she was meeting her book club again, but something didn't sit right with him. He waited until she left the house and trailed her car at a safe distance. His heart pounded as he watched her drive not to a friend's house or a cafe, but to a small motel on the edge of town. Mark parked a few blocks away, his mind racing. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the sight of Sarah entering the motel with a man, Ethan, left little room for doubt. Mark clenched his fists, the betrayal hitting him like a physical blow. He stayed in his car, torn between storming in and confronting her or waiting for a clearer opportunity. That opportunity came a few days later. Mark decided to confront Sarah indirectly, testing how far she'd go to maintain her lies. One evening he casually asked, "How's your book club going? You've been meeting up a lot lately." Sarah hesitated for a split second, then smiled. "It's been great. We're working through a long novel, so we've needed extra sessions." Mark nodded, his expression neutral, but inside, his resolve hardened. He needed undeniable proof before confronting her outright. That proof came soon enough. One morning, Sarah left her phone unattended while she showered. Mark, driven by a mixture of desperation and anger, unlocked it. His heart sank as he read through a string of texts between Sarah and Ethan. The messages were explicit, filled with plans for their next meeting and declarations of love. Mark felt a wave of emotions, rage, betrayal, and heartbreak. But instead of reacting impulsively, he decided to play the long game. He screenshotted the messages and emailed them to himself, ensuring he had evidence. Later that day, Mark sat across from Sarah at dinner, watching her closely. She chatted about her day as if nothing were amiss, but Mark could see through her act. His silence unnerved her, and she eventually asked, "Is everything okay? You've been quiet?" Mark smiled faintly. "Everything's fine," he replied, though his tone carried a weight Sarah couldn't ignore. As the days passed, the tension between them grew. Sarah began to sense that Mark knew something, but she couldn't bring herself to ask. Mark, on the other hand, was preparing for the moment when everything would come to light. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change their lives forever. Mark's suspicions had been confirmed, and Sarah's carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. The question was not if, but when. Mark had spent days simmering in the knowledge of Sarah's betrayal. Every glance at her, every word she spoke, was a painful reminder of the lies she had been feeding him. But rather than explode with anger, Mark chose a different path. He wasn't going to let emotions cloud his judgment. If Sarah wanted to deceive him, he would outsmart her. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Mark decided it was time. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with the unspoken truths that had been building between them. Sarah looked up from her plate, sensing something was off. "You've been quiet lately," she said, forcing a smile. "Is everything okay?" Mark set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, his eyes locking onto hers. "Actually no," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "There's something we need to talk about." Sarah's smile faltered. "What is it?" she asked, her tone cautious. Mark took a deep breath, then pulled his phone from his pocket. Without a word, he opened the screenshots of her texts with Ethan and slid the device across the table. Sarah's eyes widened as she stared at the screen. Her face drained of color and she fumbled for words. "Mark, I can explain," she stammered, her voice shaking. "Explain what?" Mark said, his tone icy. "That you've been sneaking around with Ethan? That you've been lying to my face for months?" "It's not what it looks like," Sarah said, her voice rising in desperation. "He's just a friend." Mark let out a bitter laugh. "A friend? Is that what you call meeting someone at a motel and texting them about how much you miss their touch? Do you think I'm stupid, Sarah?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but Mark's expression didn't soften. "Mark, please let me explain," she said. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I was lonely and you've been so distant. I felt invisible. So it's my fault?" Mark shot back, his voice sharp. "You're blaming me for your affair?" "I'm not blaming you," Sarah said, wiping her tears. I didn't know how to tell you how I felt. Ethan made me feel alive again." Mark shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Do you hear yourself? You didn't know how to tell me, so instead you betrayed me? You went behind my back, lied to me, and expected me not to notice?" Sarah broke down, her sobs filling the room. "I'm sorry, Mark. I made a mistake. Please, we can fix this." But Mark's expression remained cold. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or burning dinner," he said. This was deliberate. You made a choice every single time you saw him, texted him, or lied to me." For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by Sarah's quiet sobs. Then Mark leaned forward, his voice steady and controlled. You think I'm going to lose it, scream and throw things? No. I'm not giving you that satisfaction. But don't mistake my calm for forgiveness. Sarah looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with fear. What are you going to do? She asked hesitantly. Mark's lips curled into a bitter smile. I've already done it, he said. I've been documenting everything, your texts, your meetings, your little rendezvous at the motel. Do you know what that looks like in a divorce case, Sarah? Adultery doesn't play well in court. Sarah's eyes widened in panic. Mark, no. Please, we can work this out. I'll end things with Ethan. I'll do whatever it takes. Mark stood up, towering over her. You had your chance to fix this, Sarah. You chose to throw our marriage away. Now, I'm choosing to protect myself. He walked to the door, pausing to look back at her. You should call Ethan, he said with a sarcastic edge. Maybe he can help you figure out what to do next. I'm done. With that, Mark left the room, leaving Sarah alone with her guilt and the realization that her actions had cost her everything. Over the next few days, Sarah tried to reach out to Mark, but he was unyielding. He moved into the guest room and began working with a lawyer to prepare for divorce proceedings. Every time Sarah tried to talk to him, he shut her down with a calm but firm refusal. She felt the walls closing in, her once comfortable life now crumbling around her. Ethan, too, began to show his true colors. When Sarah told him about Mark's discovery, Ethan grew distant, claiming he couldn't handle the drama. I didn't sign up for this, he said during one of their last conversations. You need to sort out your own mess. Left with no one to turn to, Sarah realized the full weight of her mistakes. Mark, meanwhile, stayed focused on his plans. He wasn't just ending their marriage, he was making sure Sarah understood the consequences of her betrayal. When Mark finally served Sarah with divorce papers, he did so with the same calm demeanor he'd maintained throughout the ordeal. I hope this teaches you something, he said as he handed her the envelope. Actions have consequences, Sarah. Remember that. As Sarah sat alone, staring at the papers in her trembling hands, she couldn't help but think back to the choices that had brought her here. Mark's calculated response had left her with nothing. No marriage, no lover, and no way to undo the damage she had caused. Mark wasn't a man who let emotions dictate his actions. As the initial shock of Sarah's betrayal faded, he shifted his focus to ensuring that her actions didn't just hurt him, they would unravel her life as well. He didn't want vengeance fueled by anger but one driven by strategy and precision. His first step was to dismantle Sarah's lies, piece by piece. Mark began documenting every shred of evidence he had collected. Screenshots of texts, photographs of her meetings with Ethan, and timestamps that contradicted her fabricated stories about book club nights. He organized these into a digital folder labeled simply, "For Sarah." When Sarah attempted to discuss their situation, Mark would calmly remind her that everything she said could and would be used against her. You've already lied enough, he'd say with a grim smile. Let's not add perjury to your list of accomplishments. Sarah grew increasingly uneasy. Every interaction with Mark felt like walking into a trap. She tried to apologize, to reason with him, but Mark was unyielding. You built this, he'd say. Now you'll live with it. The next phase of Mark's plan was more public. While he wasn't interested in outright humiliation, he felt Sarah deserved to see the ripple effects of her choices. He started dropping subtle hints among their mutual friends. At gatherings, he would casually mention her recent personal growth journey or her exploration of new relationships. It wasn't overt, but it was enough to spark curiosity. The whispers began to spread, and Sarah found herself fielding awkward questions she couldn't answer. Ethan wasn't spared either. Mark's investigations into the man revealed more than a few skeletons in his closet. Ethan, it turned out, wasn't just seeing Sarah. He had a habit of pursuing married women. Mark discovered through social media and mutual acquaintances that Ethan was juggling multiple relationships, using charm and emotional manipulation to his advantage. Mark decided it was time Sarah saw Ethan for who he truly was. One evening, he called her into the living room and opened his laptop. You should know the truth about the man you threw everything away for, he said coldly. Sarah hesitated, but the curiosity was too strong. Mark played a recording he had obtained, a conversation between Ethan and another woman. The woman accused Ethan of making empty promises, of lying about his commitment, and of stringing her along while he pursued other affairs. Ethan's responses were slippery and non-committal, revealing his true nature. As the recording ended, Mark handed Sarah a folder of screenshots. These were texts between Ethan and another woman, filled with the same sweet words and promises he had once given Sarah. You're not special to him, Mark said bluntly. You're just another name on his list? Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as the weight of Mark's revelations hit her. The man she thought had understood her, who had made her feel alive, was nothing more than a predator exploiting her vulnerabilities. But he said, Sarah began, her voice trembling. Mark cut her off. He said whatever you wanted to hear. And you fell for it. Just like the others. Mark's final move was both practical and symbolic. Knowing the divorce proceedings would expose Sarah's infidelity, he made sure his financial and legal bases were covered. He worked closely with his lawyer to ensure a clean break, protecting his assets and his reputation. He knew Sarah's actions would make her position weak in court, and he intended to use that to his advantage. But Mark wasn't content with simply walking away. He wanted Sarah to face the full consequences of her betrayal. He made a calculated decision to meet Ethan face to face. He arranged a meeting at the cafe where their affair had started. Ethan, cocky and confident, didn't see the confrontation coming. So you're the guy, Mark said as he sat across from Ethan, his tone calm but cutting. Ethan leaned back in his chair, smirking. I suppose I am. Mark slid a manila folder across the table. You've been busy, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Ethan opened the folder, his expression shifting from smug to startled. Inside were photos of him with multiple women, texts, and notes documenting his tangled web of lies. You might want to start cleaning up your mess, Mark said, standing. Because the women you've been stringing along? They know each other now. Good luck with that. Ethan was left speechless as Mark walked away. For a man who thrived on control, the tables had turned. Sarah's world began to collapse around her. Friends grew distant, whispers followed her wherever she went, and Ethan's betrayal cut deeper than she could have imagined. When she confronted Ethan, hoping for an explanation, she found a man who had already moved on. It was fun while it lasted, he said dismissively. But I'm not looking for drama. Alone and humiliated, Sarah realized that both Mark and Ethan had outmaneuvered her. Mark, ever composed, continued to live his life with dignity. He didn't gloat or seek validation. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than any words. In the end, Sarah was left to pick up the pieces of the life she had shattered. Mark's calculated revenge had not only exposed her lies but also stripped away the illusion of the life she thought she was building with Ethan. She had lost everything, her husband, her lover, and the respect of those around her. Mark, however, walked away with his head held high. His revenge wasn't about anger or retribution. It was about reclaiming his sense of self-worth and showing Sarah that every action has consequences. And in that, he succeeded. The fallout from Mark's carefully executed revenge was swift and unforgiving. Sarah's life, once stable and predictable, was now a public spectacle. The rumors Mark had subtly fueled took on a life of their own, spreading like wildfire among their friends, family, and social circles. People whispered about Sarah's infidelity, and though Mark had never publicly shamed her, the evidence seemed to surface in unexpected places. Sarah began to notice the subtle but cutting changes. Invitations to gatherings dried up. Old friends who once confided in her now kept their distance, their polite smiles thin and wary. Her family, particularly her conservative parents, expressed their disappointment in hushed tones that cut deeper than any public scandal. We never thought you were capable of something like this, her mother had said, the words echoing in Sarah's mind long after they were spoken. Ethan, the man Sarah had risked everything for, was nowhere to be found. After their confrontation, he had ghosted her entirely, leaving her messages unanswered and her calls ignored. Sarah drove to the cafe where they had first met, hoping to find him, but he was gone. When she finally tracked him down at his apartment, his response was cold and dismissive. Sarah, it's over, Ethan said bluntly, leaning casually against his doorframe. We had our fun, but I'm not interested in cleaning up your mess. But you promised, Sarah began, her voice trembling. Ethan interrupted her with a sardonic laugh. I never promised anything. You chose this. Don't pin your bad decisions on me. The realization hit Sarah like a brick wall. Ethan had never truly cared for her. She had been nothing more than a fleeting indulgence for him. Now, abandoned and disgraced, she was left to deal with the consequences alone. Meanwhile, Mark was thriving in the aftermath of the chaos. He approached the divorce proceedings with the same calm determination that had defined his confrontation with Sarah. Armed with irrefutable evidence of her infidelity, he ensured a clean break that left him financially stable and emotionally unscathed. In court, the judge sided heavily in Mark's favor, citing Sarah's adultery as the primary cause of the dissolution of their marriage. Mark retained the house, his savings, and his reputation, while Sarah walked away with little more than a tarnished name. Her pleas for leniency fell on deaf ears. Even her lawyer's attempts to paint her as a victim of emotional neglect were dismantled by the sheer weight of the evidence Mark had presented. Mark didn't gloat, nor did he seek validation from others. Instead, he quietly closed this chapter of his life and began looking forward. He redecorated the house, removing every trace of the life he had shared with Sarah. The fresh start was symbolic, a way to reclaim his space and his identity. For Mark, the most significant victory was not in the courtroom but in the clarity he had gained. The experience, though painful, had taught him valuable lessons about trust, self-respect, and resilience. He realized that love without mutual respect and honesty was bound to crumble. He also learned the importance of maintaining his dignity in the face of betrayal. Mark's friends and family rallied around him, offering support and admiration for the way he had handled the situation. "You could have stooped to her level but you didn't," his best friend said over a drink. "That takes real strength." Though the ordeal had left its scars, Mark felt a sense of liberation. He was no longer bound by the weight of a failing marriage or the toxicity of deceit. He started focusing on himself, picking up hobbies he'd abandoned, reconnecting with old friends, and even considering dating again when the time felt right. Sarah's life, however, was a stark contrast. The public embarrassment and loss of trust from those around her were unbearable. She moved out of the house she once shared with Mark, settling into a modest apartment on the other side of town. The isolation was overwhelming. Her once busy social calendar was now empty, and every glance from a neighbor or colleague felt like judgment. At work, her reputation took a hit as well. Coworkers whispered behind her back, and opportunities that once came easily now seemed out of reach. The shame and regret weighed heavily on her, and she began to see the full scope of what she had lost, not just her marriage but her sense of self. For Sarah, the greatest punishment wasn't what Mark or others had done to her. It was the crushing realization that she had orchestrated her own downfall. She replayed the events in her mind endlessly, haunted by the choices she had made and the people she had hurt. In the end, Mark emerged as the winner, not because he sought to destroy Sarah, but because he refused to let her betrayal define him. His calm, strategic approach to the situation allowed him to protect himself and come out stronger. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving, rebuilding his life on his terms. Sarah, on the other hand, was left to pick up the pieces of the life she had shattered. The pain of her mistakes served as a harsh but necessary lesson, one she would carry with her for years to come. As Mark closed the chapter on his turbulent marriage and Sarah faced the weight of her choices, one thing became clear: betrayal leaves scars, but how you respond defines your future. This was one story of love, lies, and revenge, but every tale has its own twist. But what happens when the roles are reversed? When the one seeking revenge discovers a secret so shocking it changes everything. Stay tuned, because in our next story, the game of deception takes an unexpected turn that will leave you questioning who the real villain is. Subscribe to Unheard Stories and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Until then, remember, trust is fragile and actions always have consequences. See you soon.